From the beginning of history, the Nile has been the lifeblood of one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Its waters have flowed at the feet of Aristotle and Cleopatra, Joseph and Moses, the Crusaders, and the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. All have bathed in this stream. The Egyptians have always believed this river to be their own exclusive gift from the gods, and up until recently, it was allowed to flow unhindered to their lands. But now, all this is set to change. Upstream Ethiopia is busy building dams which threaten to cut off Egypt's water supply at the source. Many of the wars of the 20th century were all about oil. But wars of the 21st will be over water, with the Nile, the longest river in the world, at the center of the conflict. The Nile in Egypt flows almost entirely through desert. Apart from the thin strips of green-watered land which border the river on either side, the whole country is made up of inhospitable wasteland. Since the Stone Age, most Egyptians have lived very close to the Nile, dependent on it for everything. Fresh running water has always been the lifeblood of our world, but is now more precious than ever. Over the next 20 years, the amount of water available to everyone is expected to decrease by a third. But this story isn't just about water. It's about the Nile as an icon for deeply held beliefs, and about a sense of belonging which stretches back 1,000 years. This epic journey will follow the river back to its source in Ethiopia, and as the Nile winds its way back home, its waters will wash through the lives of people who cannot survive without it. The Nile flows from the heart of Africa in two main channels: the White Nile, which rises from Lake Victoria in Uganda, and the Blue Nile, which flows from the mountains of Ethiopia and which has nourished the growth of Egypt. And its capital, Cairo. With 17 million inhabitants and still growing, Cairo itself has more than doubled in size over the past 50 years. The city is now home to nearly the same number of people as the whole of Australia, all in one confined, chaotic, sprawling city. There's just not enough room here for everybody, and so some people have been pushed off the land and onto the river.
I am like a fish. You take me away from this river, and I die. I love the Nile.
This love affair with the Nile lies at the heart of the Egyptian psyche, and has existed since the age of the pharaohs and their pyramids. These monumental structures are about an hour's drive away from the Nile, in Giza, far enough through the pounding traffic and hot, messy Cairo suburbs to seem completely divorced from the river and its concerns. But it wasn't always like this. In ancient times, the Nile flowed right by here because during the summer months, the river flooded and broke its banks, with the flood waters reaching as far as Giza and beyond. This naturally recurring phenomenon was the secret behind Egypt's success. The life-giving floods provided the pharaohs with a dynamic surge of water, which allowed them to grow their crops and feed their people. It also allowed them to carry giant rocks so that they could build their pyramids. The ancient Egyptians had no idea how the floods came to them during the hot summer, when other nations withered and died in the dry heat. But they gave their gods eternal thanks for the miracle on which not just the pyramids, but their whole nation was built. And to this day, even though the floods have dried up and their gods are long gone, the monuments that were built in their honor remain, as testimony to Egypt's historic right to own and control the Nile. In Aswan, however, a city very close to Egypt's southern border, the river is upstaged by a colossus which took 10 years to complete and used up enough building materials to have constructed 17 great pyramids at Giza. The Aswan Dam. Hailed as Egypt's savior when it was completed in 1970, the dam provided the country with 90% of its electricity. But perhaps the most important reason for building this dam had nothing to do with generating power. Egypt is the driest country in the world. The Nile, although an almighty river, has sometimes revealed itself as an extremely vulnerable force. It is almost entirely dependent on upstream rains to feed and renew its flow. And in the past, when these failed, the Nile and the whole of Egypt also failed. One of the worst ever droughts happened during the times of the pharaohs and is recorded on this stone, known as the Famine Stele. These hieroglyphs tell of a 7-year-long drought when the rains did not come, and when the Nile was turned into a mud-baked trench, as if dug out especially to receive the dry corpses of the nation. But the Aswan Dam changed everything. It allowed Egypt to store vast quantities of Nile water in Lake Nasser and gave the country direct control over its most precious resource. For over 30 years, the dam has supplied Egypt with enough electricity and water to satisfy the needs of all its people. During the 1980s, when Ethiopia suffered years of terrible drought and famine, Egypt was able to bask in the reserves held in Lake Nasser. But not anymore. With 63 million inhabitants now filling up all the areas along the Nile, and with the population explosion set to continue, the Aswan Dam may not be enough to save Egypt from dying of thirst in the future. But critics say that Egypt will soon be demanding an even greater share of the Nile than it's getting already. With the other Nile nations fed up of taking a backseat and now claiming their right to the river, water wars could soon become a very real and potent danger. With Ethiopia, a country on the front line. From Egypt, the Nile snakes back through the deserts of the Sudan before splitting into two separate streams. From this point, the Nile becomes two rivers: the White Nile, with its source in Uganda, and the more powerful Blue Nile, which now takes us to the source of our story, Ethiopia. The Ethiopia we expect to see is a parched and barren country, ravaged by dictatorship and civil war, and left to rot in the midday sun. But this isn't the whole picture. Ethiopia is an incredible country of immense beauty, with an abundance of one of the most precious natural resources in the world: water. This is the country which provides Egypt with 90% of its water supply and is the source of the Nile itself. But despite its apparent water wealth, Ethiopia's problem has always been a crippling inability to use the vast percentage of it. This vast country has an estimated 37,000 square kilometers of good farmland, an area larger than Belgium that, if properly irrigated, could feed all its people all year round. To do so, however, would reduce the river's flow to Egypt dramatically and result in almost certain conflict between the two nations. "200 kilometers from Lake Tana, on one of the main distributaries of the Nile, looms a huge concrete structure, which could change the Nile basin forever." When completed, the Tekizi Dam will be one of the largest in Africa. Although the plan at the moment is to use it to generate hydroelectricity, it has the potential to retain a vast amount of water for irrigation, blocking much of its flow to Egypt. If the Tekizi scheme is successful, Ethiopia plans to build many more dams just like it. And if this happens, some experts say that Egypt's water supply could be reduced by 40% or more.
የኢትዮጵያ መንግስትና ኤብኮ የመጀመሪያው እቅድ
The Ethiopian government's first goal is to change the life of the poor, give them power, build dams to provide drinking water. There are some people who have to walk 6 to 7 hours to fetch water. The priority here is our people.
ህዝባችንን ነው መጀመሪያ።
Asfor Shigra is the Ethiopian site manager and has been working on this project for 6 years. He hardly ever sees his family, who live in the capital, Addis Ababa. But all the effort and sacrifice, he says, will be worth it. His children were very young during the famine of the 80s, and he says that he never wants to live through a period like that again.
አንደኛው ችግር
Ethiopia in the past had a lot of problems. At first, our problem was that we were unable to use our natural resources, especially unable to use the cheap resources, the rivers. Hence, there was big famine in our country. Now is the time to eradicate that famine.
The Tekizi project was on the drawing board for many years, but potential Western investors, such as the World Bank, were always scared off by belligerent noises from the Egyptian capital. So Ethiopia went east in search of help, and in 2002 found a Chinese backer for this project. The Tekizi marks a definite turning point in Ethiopia's history and in its potential to harness the Nile. It also marks the realization of many of Egypt's fears. After thousands of years of just letting it slip through their fingers, Ethiopia's new determination and ability to utilize the Blue Nile is likely to put it on a collision course with Egypt, the country which makes most use of the water downstream. Conflict has been threatened by both sides, but Asfor believes that all this doesn't have to lead to war.
When we take such measures to feed our people, Egypt, our neighbor and brother, should not be nervous and should never be. Before, there was not much understanding between us. Now, we know each other very well.
For the first time in history, all 10 Nile Basin states are meeting around one table to discuss how best to share the river. Despite Asfor's optimism, relations are still tense, and agreement between the countries is a long way off. There is hope, however, with Ethiopia and Egypt now starting to work together to face realities and find a solution to their conflicting demands. One thing is certain: to avert disaster, there will have to be compromise on both sides. War can only be avoided if every country begins to see the river as a gift for all, but a prize for none. The Nile, more than any other river in the world, evokes a feeling of continuum and everlasting presence. From Aristotle and Moses through to present-day politics, the Nile flows through the world's consciousness and its history. Now is the time to make sure that it flows through its future.